The history books say the Cold War was a peace. 46 years between the end of one world war and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and somehow the narrative settled into the idea that nothing truly catastrophic happened. Two superpowers glared at each other across an ideological divide. Proxy wars were fought on distant continents, and the whole arrangement held together because both sides were rational enough to understand that nuclear weapons made total war unthinkable. That is the version that survived into textbooks. It is also, in nearly every meaningful way, incomplete. What the official record tends to omit is the texture of those decades, the procedural reality of living inside a security apparatus that had been designed to survive its own operators. The number of times that survival came down not to statesmanship, not to diplomatic back channels, but to a single technician making a judgment call in a darkened room, or to a safety mechanism that failed to engage, or to a piece of equipment that malfunctioned at exactly the right moment rather than exactly the wrong one. The Cold War was not peaceful. It was a condition in which catastrophe was continuously deferred by margins that were far narrower than anyone in authority was prepared to admit publicly. The 20 plans and incidents examined here are drawn from declassified documents, Freedom of Information Act releases, retrospective testimony, and the quiet corrections that governments issue decades after events when the principles are dead, and the operational details no longer constitute active secrets. Some of these plans were never executed. Some were executed partially. Some resulted in accidents that were managed, contained, and then classified for 30 or 40 years. What they share is a quality of institutional seriousness. These were not the ideas of fringe actors or rogue officers. They were the products of rational bureaucratic systems doing exactly what rational bureaucratic systems do, which is to plan for every contingency, to optimize for institutional survival, and to remove human hesitation from the equation wherever possible. The first of these was a war plan so large it required its own filing system. In the late 1950s, the United States Strategic Air Command operated under a targeting doctrine that had expanded to the point of near abstraction. The Single Integrated Operational Plan, which came to be known by the abbreviation SIOP, was the master document for American nuclear warfighting. When the first version was formally briefed to civilian leadership in 1960, the projected casualty figures for a full nuclear exchange were so high that at least one senior official in the room reportedly asked whether the document he was looking at was genuine. It was. The plan called for the simultaneous delivery of thousands of nuclear weapons against the Soviet Union, China, and their satellite states. The targeting list included military installations, industrial centers, transportation hubs, and population concentrations. The expected death toll from the first strikes alone, before any Soviet retaliation, was estimated in the hundreds of millions. The plan made no provision for restraint once initiated. It was, in the language of strategic planning, a spasm attack. Everything, all at once on a timeline measured in hours. What made this plan particularly significant was not its existence, because American military planners were expected to prepare for large-scale nuclear conflict, but its architecture. The PSYOP was designed to be executed from the top down through the chain of command, but it was also designed with the understanding that the chain of command might not survive the opening moments of a Soviet first strike. Authority to release nuclear weapons was therefore pre-delegated in ways that the public was not informed of. Specific officers at specific command posts held authorization codes that could be used independently of presidential direction if communications with Washington were severed. The logic was sound from a deterrent standpoint. If the Soviet Union could neutralize American command and control with a decapitation strike, they would have a significant incentive to attempt exactly that. Pre-delegation removed that incentive by guaranteeing that retaliation would occur regardless of whether the president was alive to order it. The problem with this logic, which was recognized at the time but managed rather than resolved, was that pre-delegation also meant that nuclear weapons could be released by officers who had received incorrect information about whether a war had actually begun. The mechanisms for verifying that a Soviet attack was real rather than a false alarm were imperfect. They were known to be imperfect. The decision was made that the risks of failing to retaliate outweighed the risks of retaliating on the basis of false information. This calculus was embedded in the foundational documents of American nuclear strategy, was reviewed and maintained across multiple administrations, and remained classified for decades. The second plan that requires attention was a Soviet project that Americans spent years trying to fully understand, and that the Soviet government never officially acknowledged until after its operational period had ended. It was known informally within Soviet military circles as the perimeter system, though it was also referred to by the code name that translates roughly into English as dead hand. The system was conceived in the late 1970s and became operational in the early 1980s. Its purpose was to solve the same problem that American pre-delegation was designed to address, which was how to guarantee nuclear retaliation even if Soviet command and control had been destroyed in a first strike. The American solution relied on pre-delegated human authority. The Soviet solution was more automated. Perimeter worked by maintaining a network of sensors that monitored for the signatures of nuclear detonations on Soviet territory. If those sensors detected what appeared to be a nuclear attack, and if communications with Soviet military command had been severed, the system was designed to activate a series of command missiles that would fly over Soviet territory, broadcasting launch codes directly to nuclear-armed missiles in their silos. The missiles would then fire without requiring further human authorization. The system was not fully autonomous in the sense that it required initial human activation, and there were conditions built into its logic that were intended to prevent accidental triggering. But once activated, once the sensors had detected the appropriate signatures and the communications blackout criteria had been met, the process moved forward on its own. The humans who had built the system had, by design, removed themselves from the final decision. The existence of perimeter was not publicly confirmed by Russian officials until 1993, when a former general spoke about it in an interview. American intelligence had suspected for years that something like this system existed, and had worked to understand its parameters and its vulnerabilities. The knowledge that the Soviet Union had built a mechanism capable of launching a nuclear war without a living human being in the decision chain had a clarifying effect on certain aspects of American strategic planning, particularly around the question of whether decapitation strikes were as strategically advantageous as some planners had believed. The third plan was American, conceived in the early years of the Cold War, and it illustrates how quickly the logic of nuclear strategy moved from deterrence to something that looked considerably more like preemption. In the years immediately following the Soviet Union's successful test of an atomic bomb in 1949, American strategic planners confronted a problem that had not existed before. The United States no longer had a monopoly on nuclear weapons. Within a decade, possibly less, the Soviet Union would have enough nuclear warheads and sufficient delivery capability to threaten American cities. Once that threshold was crossed, the calculus of conflict would change permanently. The window in which the United States could fight a nuclear war and win, meaning survive with its industrial base intact, was finite and narrowing. This logic produced a set of planning documents that argued with considerable analytical rigor for conducting preventive nuclear strikes against Soviet nuclear facilities before the Soviet arsenal reached a size that made such strikes futile. The argument was not made by peripheral figures. It appeared in documents prepared by senior Air Force officers, in analyses produced by the RAND Corporation, and in internal deliberations at the highest levels of the national security establishment. The proposal was that the United States should attack the Soviet Union's nuclear weapons program, its delivery systems, and potentially its industrial centers at a moment of American choosing, before the strategic window closed permanently. These proposals were seriously considered. They were not immediately dismissed as the ideas of dangerous extremists. The counter-arguments that eventually prevailed were partly moral, but they were predominantly practical. A preventive war against the Soviet Union would require the United States to initiate a conflict that might kill tens of millions of people. Even if the military objectives were achieved, the political consequences would be severe. American allies in Europe would not support such an action. The American public had not been prepared for it. The Soviet Union, even if its nuclear facilities were destroyed, retained enormous conventional military forces that could overrun Western Europe before American ground forces could respond effectively. The preventive war option was set aside, not because it was judged to be morally impermissible, but because it was judged to be operationally unworkable under the specific conditions of the early 1950s. The fourth incident is one that most Americans have never heard of, and it happened over American soil. In January of 1961, a B-52 bomber carrying two Mark 39 thermonuclear weapons broke up in flight over Goldsboro, North Carolina. Both weapons separated from the aircraft and fell toward the ground. The first weapon struck the ground and was recovered in pieces. The second weapon behaved differently. As it fell, it completed several of the arming sequence steps that would have been necessary to detonate it. The weapon had 4 safety mechanisms. 3 of them failed during the fall. The fourth, a simple low-voltage switch, held. According to the analysis conducted by Sandia National Laboratories and later confirmed in declassified documents, had that final switch also failed, a weapon with a yield roughly 260 times greater than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima would have detonated approximately 12 miles from Goldsboro. The fallout pattern, depending on wind conditions, could have reached Washington, Baltimore, and Philadelphia. The government acknowledged the crash but did not, for several decades, publicly acknowledge how close the weapon had come to detonating. The full details emerged gradually through declassification requests, culminating in a 2013 release of a formerly secret report written by a Sandia engineer who had investigated the incident. His conclusion, quoted in subsequent reporting, was that by the slightest margin of chance, literally the failure of a single safety switch, the United States avoided a nuclear detonation on its own territory. The incident was not unique. There were dozens of accidents involving nuclear weapons during the Cold War. Most of them did not come as close to detonation as Goldsboro, but several involved circumstances in which the possibility of accidental nuclear explosion was real and acknowledged in subsequent investigations. The fifth plan moved in a different direction entirely and addressed not the delivery of nuclear weapons, but the concealment of American intentions in ways that bordered on the operationally deceptive. One of the consistent problems of early Cold War strategy was that American allies in Western Europe were essential to the forward deployment of nuclear weapons, essential to the basing of bombers and later missiles, essential to the credibility of extended deterrence, but they were not always informed about the specifics of what was being positioned on their territory or how it was intended to be used. This was not accidental. It was policy. The arrangements under which American nuclear weapons were deployed to European NATO members involved a layer of formal agreements, a layer of informal understandings, and a layer of operational reality that did not always correspond neatly to either. European governments were told in general terms that American nuclear weapons on their soil were there to deter Soviet aggression. They were not always told the specific yield of those weapons, the specific targets against which they were intended, or the specific circumstances under which American commanders might use them without seeking formal approval from the host nation's government. There were contingency plans that contemplated the use of tactical nuclear weapons in a European land battle on timelines so compressed that consulting with Allied governments would not have been operationally feasible. Those plans were real, they were maintained, they were exercised. The Allied governments on whose territory those contingencies would have unfolded were aware in general terms that such plans existed. They were not always aware of the details. The sixth matter is the Cuban Missile Crisis, but not the version that appears in most accounts. The standard narrative of October 1962 focuses on the diplomatic exchange between Kennedy and Khrushchev, the naval quarantine, the resolution. What receives considerably less emphasis are the number of moments during those 13 days when the situation nearly moved beyond the control of either leadership. There was a U-2 reconnaissance aircraft that accidentally flew into Soviet airspace during the crisis, prompting Soviet fighters to scramble and American escort aircraft to respond. The potential for that incident to be misread as the opening move of an American attack was real. There was a Soviet submarine operating in the quarantine zone, the B-59, that had been out of contact with Moscow for days and was being subjected to depth charges from American destroyers that were using a signaling protocol that had never been communicated to the Soviet submarine's captain. The captain, Valentin Savitsky, concluded from the depth charges that war had begun and ordered the preparation of the nuclear torpedo aboard his vessel. Soviet submarines of that class carried a single nuclear-tipped torpedo with a yield of approximately 10 kilotons. The authorization procedure for using it required the agreement of the submarine's captain, the political officer, and the second captain. Vasily Arkhipov, who held the position of second captain and also happened to be the flotilla commander aboard that vessel, refused to authorize the launch. His refusal was the reason the torpedo was not fired. The decision of one officer, operating without communications to his government, without accurate information about whether war had actually begun, with a commanding officer who believed it had, was the factor that prevented a nuclear detonation in the Atlantic Ocean during the most dangerous week of the Cold War. This was not a designed safety mechanism. It was not a protocol that had been established to handle exactly this scenario. It was the judgment of a specific human being in a specific moment, and it happened to be the correct judgment. The seventh plan concerns a project that American planners developed in the late 1950s and early 1960s that has come to be known informally as Project A119. The United States Air Force, in collaboration with a team of scientists that included a young Carl Sagan, studied the feasibility of detonating a nuclear device on the surface of the moon. The stated rationale for the project involved several overlapping objectives. One was straightforward intimidation. A nuclear detonation on the moon visible from Earth at night would demonstrate the reach of American nuclear capability in a way that was impossible to dismiss or misunderstand. Another rationale involved the scientific value of studying a nuclear explosion in a vacuum on a surface with known geological properties. A third consideration, less frequently discussed in the documents that have been released, was the morale dimension. The Soviet Union had launched Sputnik in 1957, and the psychological impact on American public confidence in the country's technological capabilities had been significant. A dramatic demonstration of American capability, visible to every person on Earth with eyes to look upward, might partially offset that impact. The project was studied seriously. Physicists calculated blast yields. Engineers considered delivery systems. The conclusion eventually reached was that the project was inadvisable primarily because the public relations outcome might not align with the intended effect. A nuclear explosion on the moon might be read not as a demonstration of strength, but as an act of desecration, or as evidence that the United States was willing to contaminate the solar system for political purposes. The project was shelved. The Soviet Union, it later emerged, had been conducting a parallel study of the same concept and had reached similar conclusions about its inadvisability for similar reasons. The eighth incident demonstrates how deeply the automation of nuclear response had penetrated American strategic thinking by the early 1960s. The SAGE air defense system, which became operational in the late 1950s, was a networked computer system designed to track Soviet bombers approaching American airspace and to coordinate the response of interceptor aircraft and surface-to-air missiles. It was one of the first large-scale computerized command and control systems ever built, and it represented a genuine technological achievement. It was also a system in which certain decisions were made faster than human operators could review them, and in which the parameters for what constituted a threat were established in advance by planners who could not anticipate every contingency. On multiple occasions during the operational life of SAGE and its successors, the system generated false alarms that required rapid human override. In November of 1979, a training tape containing a simulated Soviet missile attack was accidentally loaded into the actual operational system at NORAD headquarters, causing the system to display what appeared to be a massive incoming strike. Fighter aircraft were scrambled. Missile crews were alerted. It took several minutes to determine that the alert was false. The investigation found that the error had occurred because a training exercise had been loaded into a live system without adequate safeguards to prevent exactly this kind of confusion. Less than a year later, in June of 1980, a failed computer chip in the warning system generated a series of alerts indicating that Soviet submarine-launched missiles were inbound. The display showed first 2 missiles, then 220, then over 2,000. The National Security Advisor was awakened. He placed calls to the Strategic Air Command. He called the president's military aide to initiate the chain of procedures that would have put the president in contact with senior military commanders. Before that call was completed, the alert was identified as a malfunction caused by an 18-cent chip that had failed in a way that caused it to send random numbers into the reporting system. The president was not awakened. The procedures were stood down. The incident was examined in subsequent congressional hearings, during which it emerged that similar false alarms occurred with a frequency that was difficult to characterize as exceptional. The 9th plan is a British one, and its details remained classified until the 21st century. During the 1950s and into the 1960s, the United Kingdom maintained a set of continuity of government plans that addressed how British governmental authority would function following a nuclear attack. These plans involved pre-positioned supplies, hardened command bunkers, and a set of pre-delegated authorities that would allow government to continue functioning even if London and other major cities had been destroyed. What emerged from declassified documents was that the plans included provisions for the use of British nuclear weapons in circumstances where formal governmental authorization could not be obtained. Senior military commanders at specific positions in the British chain of command held sealed letters from the Prime Minister, to be opened only in the event that communications with the government had been severed, and there was reason to believe that no government survived to give orders. Those letters contained guidance about what the officer should do in the event he found himself in command of nuclear-armed forces with no one above him in the chain of command. The guidance in some versions of those letters reportedly instructed the officer to use his own judgment as a citizen and as a military professional to determine whether it was appropriate to use the weapons under his command. This is notable not because it is surprising that such guidance existed, given the strategic logic that made it necessary, but because it places the most consequential possible decision, the initiation of nuclear war, in the hands of a single officer operating in isolation, under extreme stress, with incomplete information and with no ability to consult with anyone who might disagree with his assessment. The 10th plan was American and involved not nuclear weapons, but the systematic preparation of European civilian populations for conditions following a nuclear attack. Civil defense planning in the United States and Western Europe during the 1950s and early 1960s proceeded on the assumption that nuclear war was survivable, and that governments had an obligation to prepare their citizens for survival. The fallout shelter programs, the duck and cover drills, the official pamphlets explaining how to construct a home shelter and how many days' worth of food and water to stock. These were the public face of this planning. The internal planning documents told a different story. The classified analyses of nuclear attack consequences prepared by American and British planners during this period reached conclusions that the public versions of civil defense guidance did not convey. The expected casualties from a large nuclear exchange against major urban areas were not the kinds of numbers that could be meaningfully addressed by home fallout shelters. The infrastructure disruption that would follow a nuclear attack, the loss of electrical power, water treatment, food distribution, medical facilities, was expected to cause deaths in the months following a nuclear exchange that would dwarf the immediate casualties. The civil defense programs were maintained, promoted, and funded despite the existence of internal analyses suggesting they would provide negligible benefit against the scales of attack that were actually being planned for. The decision to maintain the programs was made partly on the grounds that some preparation was better than none, but also on the explicit recognition that maintaining civil defense programs sustained public confidence that the government was doing something to protect the population. The 11th incident involves a moment in 1983 that came closer to being the start of a nuclear war than almost any other event in the Cold War, and it involved the Soviet early warning satellite system rather than an American system. On September 26 of 1983, a Soviet satellite detection system designed to monitor for American missile launches reported that the United States had launched a single intercontinental ballistic missile toward the Soviet Union. The officer on duty at the Soviet missile warning facility was Stanislav Petrov. His responsibility was to report the alert to his superiors, who would then have had minutes to decide whether to recommend a retaliatory launch. The protocol was clear. An alert of this kind was to be reported immediately up the chain of command. Petrov did not immediately report it. He waited. He looked at the data. He considered the fact that a genuine American first strike would not consist of a single missile. He considered that the satellite detection system was relatively new and had known technical limitations. He assessed the situation and concluded, without being able to confirm his assessment, that the alert was most likely a false alarm. He reported it as a system malfunction rather than a genuine attack. He was correct. The alert had been caused by a rare alignment of sunlight reflecting off of cloud cover in a way that the satellite's sensors misread as a missile launch signature. Had Petrov followed protocol and reported the alert as potentially genuine, the chain of events that would have followed is not certain, but it would have required Soviet military and political leadership to make decisions about response under the most extreme time pressure, with incomplete information during a period when Soviet-American relations were at one of their most hostile points since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The incident was not publicly known outside the Soviet Union for over a decade. The 12th Plan was one of the more elaborate American contingency frameworks of the Cold War, and it addressed what American military planners referred to as the problem of tactical nuclear weapons in a European land battle. By the early 1960s, both NATO and the Warsaw Pact had deployed large numbers of short-range and medium-range nuclear weapons in Central Europe. American planning for a conventional Soviet invasion of Western Europe contemplated the early use of these weapons to compensate for what was assessed as a significant Soviet advantage in conventional military forces. The specific plans for how tactical nuclear weapons would be used in a European battle were extraordinarily detailed. They specified which weapons would be used at what points in a battle, which units would authorize their employment, what the command and control arrangements would be, and how escalation from tactical to strategic nuclear use would be managed. The problem that planners never satisfactorily solved was the escalation management piece. The assumption embedded in many of these plans was that it was possible to use nuclear weapons in a battlefield context without triggering a strategic nuclear exchange. This assumption was challenged at the time by analysts who argued that any use of nuclear weapons in a European conflict would create pressures for escalation that neither side would be able to resist, and that the distinction between tactical and strategic nuclear use would dissolve under the political and military pressures of an actual conflict. These arguments were taken seriously, were never fully refuted, and did not ultimately change the plans. The tactical nuclear plans remained in place because the alternative was accepting that NATO could not defend Western Europe against a Soviet conventional attack, which was politically unacceptable. The 13th matter concerns a program that the American government maintained for decades under extreme secrecy, and that, when its details began to emerge through declassification, produced considerable discomfort among the Western European governments whose territory and populations had been the subject of the planning. Operation Gladio was a network of stay-behind organizations established in Western European countries in the late 1940s and early 1950s. The premise was straightforward. If the Soviet Union invaded Western Europe and overran NATO defenses, there would need to be organized resistance networks already in place in the occupied territories to conduct sabotage, gather intelligence, and support any eventual liberation effort. These networks were organized covertly, were funded, and in some cases armed through CIA channels, and were maintained without the knowledge of most officials in the governments of the countries where they operated. The existence of Gladio was publicly acknowledged by Italian Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti in 1990 in the context of an Italian parliamentary investigation into political violence during the post-war decades. What emerged from the subsequent investigations conducted in multiple European countries was that the stay-behind networks had not simply prepared for a hypothetical Soviet occupation. In some countries, elements of these networks had been involved in domestic political activities that went considerably beyond their original counterinsurgency mandate. The degree to which this represented official policy, as opposed to unauthorized action by network members, varied by country and remains contested in some cases. What was not contested was that networks had been maintained, armed, and partly funded by American intelligence in the territories of Allied democratic governments, without those governments' full knowledge. The 14th plan involves a technological system that American planners and engineers spent enormous resources developing, and that, in retrospect, illustrated some of the characteristic tensions between the imperatives of speed and the requirements of safety that ran through the entire Cold War. The Permissive Action Link, known by the abbreviation PAL, was a safety device designed to prevent the unauthorized use of nuclear weapons. The concept was straightforward. Nuclear weapons would be equipped with electronic locks that required the correct code to be entered before the weapon could be armed. Without the correct code, the weapon could not be detonated. Codes would be held at the highest levels of authority, meaning that a rogue officer or a terrorist who somehow obtained a nuclear weapon would be unable to use it. The development and implementation of PAL technology proceeded through the 1960s. But the implementation was not uniform, and in some cases the security of the PAL system was compromised in ways that illustrated the tension between operational convenience and genuine security. Documents that have been declassified and subsequent reporting revealed that at some American nuclear installations, the PAL codes were set to sequences that could be easily overridden or were shared in ways that reduced their security value, because the military units responsible for those weapons prioritized rapid employment over the kinds of safeguards that the PAL system was intended to provide. In at least some cases, the effective PAL code protecting certain nuclear weapons was reported to have been a sequence of zeros, which provided essentially no additional barrier against unauthorized use beyond what the physical security of the installation already provided. The 15th incident is one of the most operationally significant nuclear close calls of the entire Cold War, and it occurred not in the United States or the Soviet Union, but in the waters off the coast of Norway in January of 1995. A Norwegian scientific team launched a rocket from the Andøya Space Center to conduct atmospheric research. The rocket, which reached altitudes typically associated with ballistic missile trajectories, triggered alarms in Russian early warning systems. Russian President Boris Yeltsin was informed. The nuclear briefcase, the device that would allow Yeltsin to authorize a nuclear launch, was activated for the first time in the history of the Russian Federation. For several minutes, Yeltsin and his military advisors assessed whether Russia was under attack. The rocket continued on its trajectory. Russian radar operators tracked it as it moved away from Russian territory. The assessment shifted to false alarm. The briefcase was stood down. This incident occurred 4 years after the end of the Cold War. The institutional systems that had been built during the Cold War, the satellite networks, the radar arrays, the command briefcases, the pre-delegated authorities, had not been substantially modified by the end of the Soviet Union. They continued to operate, continued to generate alerts, continued to require human beings to make rapid assessments under pressure. The Norway incident was an accident involving a civilian scientific rocket that was entirely unclassified and for which advance notice had been provided to Russian authorities through official channels. The notice had not been passed to the appropriate radar operators. The system had functioned in the sense that it detected the launch correctly and had failed in the sense that the information context that would have immediately identified the launch as non-threatening had not reached the people who needed it. The 16th plan was a Soviet one, and its scope was not fully understood by Western intelligence for years after it was executed. During the early 1980s, Soviet leadership became genuinely convinced, based on a combination of intelligence assessments and ideological interpretation of American actions, that the United States was preparing a nuclear first strike against the Soviet Union. This conviction was not an artifact of paranoia operating in a vacuum. It developed in the context of the Reagan administration's significant buildup of American military forces, the deployment of Pershing II missiles to Western Europe, the acceleration of American research into ballistic missile defense, and a series of American military exercises that Soviet intelligence interpreted as rehearsals for decapitation strikes against Soviet command and control. Operation Ryan, which stood for a Russian acronym translating roughly as nuclear missile attack, was a KGB and GRU intelligence-gathering operation of exceptional scale, tasked with monitoring for indicators that a Western nuclear attack was imminent. Soviet intelligence stations around the world were instructed to report on specific indicators, including the movement of Western leaders to protected facilities, changes in military readiness postures, unusual patterns in military communications, and the activation of emergency government protocols. The operation created an environment in which Soviet intelligence analysts were systematically looking for evidence that confirmed what their leadership feared, rather than conducting balanced assessments of Western intentions. This dynamic reached its most acute expression in November of 1983, when NATO conducted a large-scale command post exercise called Able Archer 83. The exercise was designed to practice the political and military procedures for transitioning from conventional to nuclear war. It was realistic enough that Soviet intelligence, which was monitoring Western communications extensively during this period, concluded that it might be a cover for an actual preparation for nuclear attack. Soviet forces in Eastern Europe were placed on heightened alert. Soviet nuclear-capable aircraft in several Warsaw Pact countries were reportedly placed on increased readiness. The United States intelligence community, monitoring Soviet responses to the exercise, recognized that Soviet forces were reacting in ways that indicated genuine concern rather than routine alertness, and the assessment reached American leadership that the Soviet Union had come genuinely close to concluding that a nuclear war was about to begin. The 17th plan is one of the least discussed aspects of Cold War nuclear strategy and involves the specific arrangements that governed the use of American nuclear weapons stationed in Europe under NATO's nuclear sharing framework. The political requirement of extended deterrence, meaning the American commitment to defend Western Europe with nuclear weapons, required that European NATO members have some meaningful role in nuclear decisions that affected their territory. The practical requirement of nuclear security meant that American control over those weapons had to be maintained. These two requirements were reconciled through arrangements that gave European governments the legal and political form of participation while maintaining American control over the physical weapons. The specific arrangement that applied to some European NATO members involved a dual-key system in which both the American custodians of the weapons and the host nation military forces had to agree before a weapon could be employed. The dual-key system was genuine in some applications. In others, the American half of the system was the effective constraint, because American consent was required regardless of host nation wishes, while in practice, the host nation half of the system could be bypassed in circumstances where American commanders judged that time constraints made consultation impractical. The European allies were aware, in general terms, that their formal role in nuclear decision-making was more limited than the political framework suggested. The arrangement was maintained because the alternative, either removing American nuclear weapons from European territory or giving European governments genuine independent authority over those weapons, created problems that were considered more significant than the ambiguity of the existing framework. The 18th incident involves the city of Damascus, Arkansas, and a sequence of events in September of 1980 that resulted in a nuclear weapon being propelled by a rocket fuel explosion out of its underground silo and into a ditch approximately 200 feet from the launch complex. A maintenance worker performing routine work on a Titan II intercontinental ballistic missile dropped a socket wrench socket, which fell into the silo, bounced off infrastructure, and punctured the missile's first-stage fuel tank. Hypergolic rocket fuel began leaking into the silo. The leak was initially assessed as manageable. Over the following hours, the situation deteriorated. The vapor concentration in the silo reached explosive levels. A fuel-air explosion blew the silo door off and ejected the missile's re-entry vehicle, which contained a single 9-megaton nuclear warhead, out of the silo. The warhead did not detonate. Nuclear weapons are designed with multiple safeguards against accidental detonation, and those safeguards held in this case. But a 9-megaton weapon was lying in a field in Arkansas, having been blown out of the ground by an explosion, having experienced whatever physical stresses the explosion had imposed, and having not been designed with the expectation that this particular sequence of events would be part of its operating environment. One Air Force officer was killed in the explosion. 21 others were injured. The warhead was recovered, examined, and found to be intact. The incident was publicly acknowledged within days, but the full details of the warhead's condition and the specific risks involved were not released for many years. The 19th plan addresses not a single incident, but a systematic pattern that characterized American nuclear weapons management during the Cold War, and that has been documented extensively through declassification and the work of journalists and historians who have spent decades reconstructing it. The pattern concerns the relationship between the design requirements of nuclear weapons as safety devices and the operational requirements of nuclear weapons as military instruments. These requirements were frequently in tension, and the resolution of that tension was not always resolved in favor of safety. The demands of deterrence required that nuclear weapons be reliable. An adversary needed to believe that American nuclear weapons would actually detonate if used, that they would function as designed, that the threat they represented was real. This requirement pushed in the direction of ensuring that nuclear weapons were fully functional as weapons, that safety mechanisms did not introduce uncertainties about performance, and that the weapons were in a state that allowed for rapid employment. The demands of safety required that nuclear weapons have robust safeguards against accidental or unauthorized detonation. These requirements sometimes pointed in opposite directions. A safety mechanism that prevented accidental detonation was also, from certain angles, a mechanism that introduced uncertainty about whether the weapon would function as intended under all conditions. The specific history of American nuclear weapons design includes multiple periods in which weapons were deployed in states that independent safety analysis subsequently identified as presenting meaningful risks of accidental detonation. These risks were known to portions of the bureaucracy responsible for nuclear weapons. They were assessed, documented, and in some cases accepted explicitly on the grounds that the operational benefits of the existing configuration outweighed the safety risks. The documents describing these assessments were classified for decades. When they became available, they revealed that the margin between the arsenal that was deployed and an arsenal that would have detonated accidentally was narrower than the official reassurances offered to the public and to elected officials had suggested. The 20th plan is not a single plan at all, but the aggregate system, the totality of procedures, doctrines, pre-delegated authorities, automated responses, sealed letters, command posts, satellite networks, submarine patrols, alert aircraft, and bureaucratic protocols that constituted the Cold War nuclear posture of both superpowers. This system was designed to guarantee that nuclear weapons would be used if deterrence failed, that no single point of failure, No decapitation strike, no communications disruption, no failure of will at the top of the chain of command could prevent the retaliation that would make a first strike irrational. It was designed with great care, great technical sophistication, and considerable intellectual rigor. It was also a system that generated, as a byproduct of its design, a persistent probability of catastrophic accident. The probability at any given moment was low. Over 46 years, multiplied across thousands of incidents involving nuclear weapons, across dozens of false alarms, across the specific human and mechanical failures that have been documented, the cumulative probability of accidental nuclear war was not trivially small. The people who operated within this system understood this. The analysts who studied it understood this. The conclusion that was drawn, and that was drawn with a consistency that itself reveals something important about how institutions manage existential risk, was that the probability was acceptable. That judgment was made not publicly, not in a forum that allowed for democratic input or contestation, but administratively, by officials whose responsibility was to manage the system rather than to question its fundamental premises. The Cold War ended in 1991. When the Soviet Union dissolved. The formal end of the Cold War did not dismantle the warning systems, the pre-delegated authorities, the command submarines, the sealed letters, or the automated response mechanisms that the Cold War had produced. Some of these systems were modified, some were reduced in scale. The fundamental architecture, the logic of guaranteed retaliation, the automation of certain response thresholds, the distribution of authority to use nuclear weapons across chains of command that could function independently of central control. This architecture persisted because the weapons that had necessitated it also persisted. The Soviet Union ceased to exist. The weapons remained. The systems built to manage the weapons remained. The institutional cultures that had developed around those systems remained. The Cold War ended without resolving the machinery that had made it so persistently dangerous, and that machinery, in modified form, continued to operate.